In April 2019, the world watched in horror as Notre Dame burned. People cried in the streets. Complete strangers hugged each other. Billionaires pledged hundreds of millions of dollars within hours. Over $1 billion, just like that. But here's what you probably don't know. In 1830, nobody cared. The people of Paris didn't love Notre Dame. They didn't even like it. They thought it was ugly. They thought it was barbaric. They were actively letting it rot so they could tear it down and build something modern. The cathedral was dying, not from fire, from indifference. And then Victor Hugo wrote a book. He didn't write it just for the money. He didn't write it just to tell a love story. He wrote it as a weapon. A 900-page PR campaign designed to force an entire nation to look at a crumbling building and see beauty instead of trash. This is the story of how a novel saved a landmark. To understand why this book mattered, you have to understand how much Paris hated this building. It was a disaster. The stained glass windows, those gorgeous medieval masterpieces, had been ripped out, replaced with plain white glass because some genius decided the church needed more light. The sculptures were missing limbs. The walls were crumbling. The whole place looked like a haunted house that had given up. And the statues? Oh, the statues. During the French Revolution, an angry mob stood in front of the cathedral and pointed at the 28 statues on the west facade. "Those are kings," someone shouted. They weren't. They were biblical figures, kings of Judah from the Old Testament. But the mob didn't care about details. They cared about symbols. Everything and anything that looked like a king had to go. So they tore down all 28 statues, dragged them into the square, and cut off their heads. In 1977, workers digging in Paris found 21 of those heads buried behind a wall. Someone had secretly saved them, hid them like contraband. For almost 200 years, those stone faces sat in the dark, waiting. But that wasn't the worst of it. The revolutionaries turned Notre Dame into something called the Temple of Reason. They kicked out God and installed a new goddess, literally. They dressed up an actress in a revealing outfit, put her on a throne at the altar, and called her the Goddess of Reason. The whole city came to worship her. Then they got bored with that and turned the cathedral into a warehouse, a storage facility. They kept wine barrels and grain sacks where priests once held mass. By 1830, Notre Dame had been a church again for a few decades, but nobody had bothered to fix it. Napoleon had crowned himself emperor there in 1804, but even then, they had to hang fabric over the walls to hide how bad things had gotten. And here's the kicker. The city was seriously considering demolishing it. Not because of budget cuts, not because of some emergency, because they thought Gothic architecture was ugly. See, back then, Gothic wasn't a compliment. It was an insult. The term originally meant barbaric, as in built by Goths, those uncivilized tribes who sacked Rome. The fashionable people of Paris looked at Notre Dame the way you might look at a rundown strip mall. An eyesore, a relic, something that should be replaced with something modern and tasteful. The cathedral that would one day make billions of people cry was being treated like garbage. The only person in Paris who seemed to care was a 28-year-old writer named Victor Hugo. He was an architecture nerd, a massive, unapologetic architecture nerd. Hugo didn't just appreciate old buildings, he worshipped them. He spent hours wandering through medieval churches, running his hands over ancient stones, getting genuinely emotional about flying buttresses. The man had feelings about flying buttresses. One story says he found the word Ananke carved into a dark corner of Notre Dame, Greek for fate or doom. He became obsessed with it. Who carved it? When? Why? He went back to find it again, but it had been scraped off or painted over. That single vanished word haunted him. It became the seed for his entire novel. And what he saw happening to Paris made him furious. Buildings were being demolished everywhere. Medieval monuments that had stood for centuries were being knocked down to make room for new developments. The city was erasing its own history, and nobody seemed to care. So in 1825, Hugo wrote an essay called War on the Demolishers. Yes, that was the actual title. Guerre aux démolisseurs. He wasn't being subtle. In it, he raged against what he called vandalism. Not the spray paint kind, but the systematic destruction of France's architectural heritage. He called out specific buildings that had been destroyed. He named names. He basically wrote an angry letter to all of Paris and published it in a literary journal. The essay landed with a thud. Almost nobody read it. Nobody cared. But Hugo wasn't done. He realized that if a straightforward argument wouldn't work, he needed a different weapon. He needed a story. Something that would make people feel what he felt when he looked at these buildings. Something that would make them see Notre Dame the way he saw it, not as an ugly relic, but as a living monument to human achievement. So he locked himself in his apartment. Literally. According to legend, he gave away all his clothes so he couldn't go outside. For 4.5 months, he wrote like a man possessed. The result was Notre Dame de Paris, the book you know as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And here's the thing you need to understand. Hugo didn't love the characters more than the building. He loved the building more than the characters. The book wasn't really about Quasimodo. It wasn't really about Esmeralda. The main character was the cathedral itself. I need you to forget everything Disney taught you about this story. The original French title is Notre Dame de Paris, not The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The English publishers changed it because they thought British readers would care more about a dramatic character than a building. They missed the entire point. Hugo devoted whole chapters, not scenes, entire chapters, to describing the cathedral in exhaustive detail. He wrote about the architecture, the history, the way light fell through the windows. Modern readers sometimes skip these sections because they seem like tangents. They're not tangents. They're the heart of the book. One chapter is literally called A Bird's Eye View of Paris. It's just Hugo describing what you'd see if you climbed the towers and looked out over the city. No plot, no dialogue, just a man gushing about rooftops and church spires for pages. He describes Notre Dame the way other writers describe beautiful women. He calls it a vast symphony in stone. He talks about its scars and imperfections like they're battle wounds that make it more noble. The building isn't the setting. The building is the love interest. And here's the tell. Look at how Hugo treats his human characters versus how he treats the cathedral. Esmeralda, she's beautiful but naive. Frollo, brilliant but twisted. Phoebus, handsome but shallow. Quasimodo, loyal but doomed. Every human character has a fatal flaw, but Notre Dame, Hugo describes it as perfect, wounded by time and stupidity, yes, but never flawed. The humans fail each other. The cathedral just stands there, waiting for someone to notice how magnificent it is. And there's one chapter that tells you everything about Hugo's real agenda. It's called Ceci tuera cella. This will kill that. The villain Frollo holds up a printed book and points at the cathedral. This will kill that, he says. The book will kill the building. Hugo believed that before books existed, buildings were how humanity told stories. Cathedrals were books you could walk through. Every sculpture, every window told a story that illiterate peasants could understand. Then Gutenberg invented the printing press, and ideas could spread faster through paper than through stone. Here's the irony. Hugo was using the very technology that killed architecture to try to save it. He was using a book to save a building, and it worked. Okay, let's talk about what Disney did to this story. Because the differences matter. In the Disney version, the gargoyles talk. They're comic relief. They sing songs and crack jokes. In Hugo's book, the gargoyles are stone, silent, dead. Quasimodo talks to them, but they never answer. He's so lonely that he's invented friends who can't respond. In Disney's version, Esmeralda survives. She ends up with the handsome captain. Everyone lives happily ever after. In Hugo's book, Esmeralda is hanged, publicly executed. Quasimodo watches from the tower of Notre Dame as the woman he loves dies at the end of a rope. Then he throws Frollo off the cathedral tower. And then, and this is the part that really gets me, Quasimodo disappears. Years later, workers open a mass grave and find two skeletons embracing. One is a woman, the other is a hunchback. Quasimodo crawled into Esmeralda's tomb and died holding her corpse. When they try to separate the bones, now the hunchback's skeleton crumbles to dust. That's how the book ends. No happy ending, no redemption, No triumph of love over hate. Just death and dust and a crumbling skeleton that falls apart at the touch. Why did Hugo write it this way? Because he needed you to feel something. He needed the story to hurt. A happy ending would have been satisfying, but a tragic ending is unforgettable. You don't walk away from that book thinking about true love conquering all. You walk away haunted. And when you're haunted, you remember. You remember the cathedral. You remember what it meant to Quasimodo, even if it couldn't save him. You remember that this building, this real building that you could actually visit, was the setting for all that tragedy. Hugo weaponized grief. He made readers mourn fictional characters, and in doing so, he made them care about a real building. The book was a phenomenon. It became a bestseller almost overnight. People who had never given Notre Dame a second thought suddenly wanted to see it. Tourists started showing up. Parisians who had walked past the cathedral their whole lives started actually looking at it. And they didn't like what they saw. The book had described Notre Dame in all its medieval glory. The reality was a crumbling ruin with missing statues and plain glass windows and walls that were literally falling apart. The contrast was embarrassing. Public pressure mounted. People started asking uncomfortable questions. Why are we letting this building rot? Why haven't we fixed it? Hugo had written in his essay that sometimes you save an admirable church by writing about it. He was right. In 1844, the French government finally did something. They hired two architects, Jean-Baptiste Lassus and Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, to restore Notre Dame. The restoration took 20 years. 20 years of scaffolding and sculptors and stonemasons. They rebuilt the statues. They restored the windows. They added a new spire to replace the medieval one that had been torn down. And Viollet-le-Duc, he put his own face on the building. Literally. He designed statues of the 12 apostles to surround the new spire and made St. Thomas, the patron saint of architects, look exactly like himself. The guy restored a cathedral and snuck in a selfie. That takes a special kind of ego. But here's where the story takes a wild turn. Viollet-le-Duc didn't just restore Notre Dame, he reinvented it. You know those famous gargoyles? The ones that have become the iconic image of the cathedral. The brooding demons staring out over Paris, chin in hand, like they're contemplating the meaning of existence. They're not medieval. They're not even close. Viollet-le-Duc added them in the 1850s. The most recognizable feature of Notre Dame, the thing every tourist photographs, the image that appears on every postcard, was invented by a 19th century architect who was inspired by Victor Hugo's novel. The book literally changed the architecture. The original medieval gargoyles had been removed or destroyed over the centuries. The last ones came down in 1813. Viollet-le-Duc designed new ones based on his imagination of what a Gothic cathedral should look like. And his imagination was shaped by Hugo's descriptions. The famous Strige, that melancholy demon with his tongue sticking out, was sculpted in 1850, inspired by the character of Quasimodo. A fictional character created to save a building ended up being carved into the building itself. Hugo wrote a book about a cathedral. The book became so popular that they restored the cathedral. And they restored it to match the book. The fiction became the reality. Now let's talk about the fire in 2019. When the spire fell, people wept. Billionaires threw money at the problem instantly. The entire world treated it like a death in the family. Why? It wasn't because of the architecture. There are older churches. There are bigger churches. It was because of the story. Victor Hugo didn't just save a building. He turned it into a celebrity. Before his book, Notre Dame was just a pile of rocks. After his book, it was a character. When people watched the fire, they weren't seeing a burning roof. They were seeing Quasimodo's home. They were seeing the gargoyles they grew up with, which, remember, are fake. They were seeing that Disney movie and the musical and the novel all burning at once. Hugo proved that if you want to save a building, you don't need a petition. You need a myth. He didn't make us better people who care about art. He just manipulated us perfectly. He engineered a tragedy so catchy that 200 years later, we are still reacting exactly the way he wanted us to. So, did the book save the cathedral? Yes. But it did something weirder. It replaced the cathedral. If you visit Paris today, You will see the statues Viollet-le-Duc built because of the book. You will see the gargoyles that were added to match the book's vibe. The real Notre Dame is gone. The one standing there today is basically a monument to Victor Hugo's imagination. Hugo tried to use fiction to save reality. Instead, the fiction became the reality. The Hunchback ends with Quasimodo's skeleton crumbling to dust in a grave. But the cathedral, it's still standing. Not because it's holy, and not because it's stone, but because a 29-year-old writer decided to make it the main character of a bestseller. The stones can burn, the story is fireproof,